The first is Elsden Best. Elsden Best was a New Zealand anthropologist who did a lot of ethnographic fieldwork and documented a lot of the practices of the Maori people. Now, one thing that Elsden Best documented that was very interesting to Marcel Mauss was something called the how. How is the spirit of an object, and when it comes to gift giving, the how is the spiritual innermost being of a gift, which makes it necessary to treat it with respect. And the spirit of the gift is passed from one person to another person, but must be passed on or reciprocated before it causes harm to the person who receives the gift. And this was this was one ethnographic piece of fieldwork that informed Marcel Mauss's essay on the gift. The second anthropologist whose fieldwork informed Marcel Mauss's essay on the gift is Franz Boas. And Franz Boas is a very famous anthropologist, probably most famous for his work on cultural relativism, which is the view that every society has to be understood on its own terms. Franz Boas was very taken with the Kwakiutl people of British Columbia. And so he conducted fieldwork along the northwestern coast of North America. And one ceremony that he documented that caught Marcel Mauss's attention was a ceremony called the potlatch ceremony. Potlatch is a Chinook word for meaning to nourish or to consume. And these ceremonies are an example of a total system of giving where we see extreme rivalry between people to return more than what is received. So during potlatch ceremonies, chiefs and tribes would gather and then they would give gifts. The chiefs from different tribes would give gifts to each other and give gifts to all the people. Lavish rugs and beautiful objects, even slaves. And they would try to give more gifts than the other chiefs. And the gift giving was so rampant that they would run out of people to give to, and they would start burning the objects that they were giving to each other. So they would burn the rugs, or they would even push the slaves into the sea. And that's something that we call conspicuous consumption, the public destruction of goods in the hope of gaining more social status. So Franz Boas, who did work with Kwakiutl people and on the potlatch ceremony, informed Marcel Mauss's essay on the gift, his idea of total prestations. The third anthropologist who informed Marcel Mauss's essay on the gift is Bronislaw Malinowski. Now, Bronislaw Malinowski did intense fieldwork for a long duration on the Kirawina Island in Melanesia, and he's most well remembered for his detailed and thorough ethnographies of the Trobriand Islanders. And his ethnographies are still held up today as being a very good example of how thorough you have to be when you're doing ethnographic fieldwork with a group. One particular practice that Bronislaw Malinowski studied, and that was of particular interest to Marcel Mauss, was something called the cooler ring. Now, the cooler ring was a circle of 18 islands where people would circulate gifts around these rings. So some gifts would go in a clockwise direction, some gifts would go in an anti-clockwise direction. And taking part in this cooler ring was an opportunity for social mobility, but it also took a lot of personal investment and a lot of investment from the tribe. And it led to a lot of social cohesion amongst the islanders, but it also was an opportunity for people to demonstrate their authority, their leadership, their status in the group. So there's three anthropologists who have informed Marcel Mauss's essay on the gift. Now we're going to turn to three anthropologists whose work has been inspired by Marcel Mauss's essay on the gift. Okay, so the first of these anthropologists is Edward Evans Pritchard. Evans Pritchard did work among the Azandi people. He also did work among the newer people of southern Sudan in Africa. He was inspired by the gift to pay attention to the circulation of cattle and men and women and children among the newer of the southern Sudan. When he was doing field work, he found that no matter what conversation he was having, it would always return to cattle. And I should say that the newer people were herders. They had cattle. That was their economy in some ways. And every conversation he had with the newer people, whether it was about marriage, whether it was about courtship, whether it was about... it didn't matter what the conversation was, inevitably Evans Pritchard found that the conversation would come back to cattle. And to the point that Evans Pritchard said that the central idiom of the newer people was the bovine idiom. And because of his keen eye paying attention to the notion of gift giving among people, Evans Pritchard described the marriage dues of the newer as a strand in the total circulation of cattle and wives and children and men. Another anthropologist who has been greatly influenced by Marcel Mauss's essay on the gift is Claude Levi Strauss, a French anthropologist. The essay on the gift gave the impetus to Levi Strauss's theory of structuralism and how affinality in in-law relations were established through the exchange of people between families. Levi Strauss, bouncing off the essay on the gift, saw that transfers of men and women are the most important among the gifts in total symbolic systems. This is bouncing off the essay on the gifts and also drawing upon his own fieldwork in Brazil, in the Amazon. So Marcel Mauss also created a very solid foundation for Levi Strauss's theory of structuralism. By defining the social world as a world of symbolic relationships, Marcel Mauss connected the mental life of the individual to the collective life of the group. So this was someone who was probably the most inspired by Marcel Mauss's essay on the gift. A third anthropologist that I'd like to introduce you to, who has been inspired by Marcel Mauss's essay on the gift, is Mary Douglas. Mary Douglas wrote a book called The World of Goods, where she argued that our consumption behaviour is much more about giving than economists realise. She believed that class structure could be revealed through information about giving within and exclusion from the reciprocal cycles of exchange. And in fact, she wrote a foreword to one of the later reprints of Marcel Mauss's essay on the gift in English. Okay, so now let's look at three scholars who have developed further theory about the gift. Okay. The first scholar that we'll look at is Karl Polanyi. Karl Polanyi was an economic historian. He drew on a lot of ethnographic studies, and he came up with three kinds of reciprocity, or three kinds of gift giving. He saw reciprocity. There was basic reciprocity, which was the barter or direct exchange of goods and services. So, I'll do an hour of carpentry if you do an hour of masonry for me, for example, or I'll give you a chicken, you give me a duck. Basic barter or direct exchange between people. He also thought that there was redistribution, or found that there was redistribution. So, for example, say you've got a crop and you have a surplus of produce, then you can take that surplus yield and give it to a higher authority who will then redistribute it. In modern society, we would call that tax. Giving off some of your wealth to a higher authority who then distributes it. The third part of Karl Polanyi's theory of the gift was that of the market principle, so that goods and services are sold in an anonymous market. So by using money, for example, I can go to the corner store and I can buy a chocolate bar. I don't need to know the name of the person behind the counter. He doesn't need to know my name, but we can exchange some goods according to the market principle. The second person I'd like to look at who has developed some further theory on the gift is Marshall Sahlins. Marshall Sahlins is a very famous anthropologist. He's still living, at least at the time I filmed this. I believed he was still living. And he came up with 3 kinds of gift giving. So the first is balanced reciprocity, just the same as Karl Polanyi, sort of basic barter, market trade, tit-for-tat exchange, and an example, the chicken for the duck, or the hour of work for your hour of work, sort of kind of thing. The second kind of gift giving that he came up with was generalized reciprocity. So this is very similar to Mauss's idea of total prestations. This is an incomplete social exchange with delayed repayment and undefined interest. So I give a gift, and then someone else will give me a gift in return, but later, and perhaps it's going to be a bigger gift than the gift I gave them in the first place. Marshall Sahlins found that this, based on his knowledge, he found that this was the most common form of exchange within the household and among relatives. So he was very interested in the spatiality of the gift, so the relationship between people and the kinds of gift giving. And he found that the closer people are together, the more generalized reciprocity is common. The further apart people are, the less common generalized reciprocity is, the more common balanced reciprocity is, and the more common, even the further apart they are, the more common something called negative reciprocity is. And this is the third kind of reciprocity that Marshall Sahlins identified. Negative reciprocity is economic deception. It's where one person tries to reap benefits without paying the cost. For example, fraud or theft or ruthless haggling. And in Marshall Sahlins' book Stone Age Economics, he found that economic deception, or this negative reciprocity, was most common amongst people who were very far apart from each other, very socially distinct from each other. The third theorist I'd like to look at, who is a very interesting sociologist, is called Viviana Zelizer. Viviana Zelizer has come up with 3 kinds of gift in her theory. The first is the original notion of the gift as a voluntary offering, as the voluntary bestowal on another that implies intimacy and or inequality, plus a certain arbitrariness. And now, even if this concept only exists in concept, it's still worth contemplating, because people still make claims to giving these kinds of gifts. And making those claims says something. So it's interesting to keep that original definition of the gift as something that's voluntary and disinterested. The second kind of gift that the second kind of reciprocity that she looked at was entitlement. So the right to share, the right to share of something, or a strong claim to power and autonomy by the recipient. So, for example, say I'm part of a tribe, and the hunters come back with a kill. I have a right to a share of that meat because I'm part of the tribe. Or, for example, a child's entitlement to a parent's cooking. The third kind of reciprocity that she identified was compensation. And this is a direct and equal exchange of values, and a certain distance, contingency, bargaining, and accountability among the partners. So, for example, a fisherman and a hunter exchange equal weight of fish and meat, for example. Now, Viviana Zelizer is particularly interested in how people negotiate the meaning of exchanges and the vulnerability of social relations. So, she found that reciprocity was distinguished by the relational content and meaning of the transaction and the time duration of the relation. So, for example, someone who receives money after coitus might insist that this money is a gift, not necessarily compensation. Or she also talked about employees who insisted that their Christmas bonus was an entitlement, not a gift, because the meaning of entitlement and the meaning of gift have different social consequences. And she was very interested in how people negotiate what the meaning of reciprocity is. And I think it's very worthwhile playing with her ideas. So now we come to the final section of the gift, where we get to have a bit of a play around with some of the ideas in the gift. So I'd like to inspire you, hopefully, to think about gift giving in your everyday life or perhaps in your research. Now, we've got reciprocity. When have you given a gift and it hasn't been understood? Or when have you been given something that you felt was not quite matching what you had given them in the first place? And this is, now when it comes down to reciprocity is really what Levi Strauss felt was the essential element of Mauser's essay on the gift. And so we can think about patterns of reciprocity in our own life. When have we, I used to give a lift to this guy back from parties when I was in university. And then one day he had a car and I didn't. And I said, oh, can you give me a lift? And he didn't. And I felt really disrespected, actually, and that finished our friendship, because I thought, no, if this guy doesn't understand reciprocity, then he's not worth having as a friend. And so, why is reciprocity important? Why is it valued? What kinds of practices of reciprocity can you think of in your life? The next is conspicuous consumption. What kinds of conspicuous consumption can you think of that you've seen in your life? Patterns, for example, of people putting on lavish balls where they consume superfluous amounts of food, spend lots of money on costumes that they might only ever use once, spend lots of money on decorations. Another very simple example of conspicuous consumption that I can think of is a champagne shower at the Grand Prix. Someone who wins then destroys this very expensive champagne by spraying it on everyone. But also I'd like to challenge you to think about other kinds of conspicuous consumption. For example, charity. Charity is someone giving away money or goods with no benefit to themselves, but charity is an investment in self-image. And so how is charity an example of conspicuous consumption? Or is it indeed an example of conspicuous consumption? The third kind of reciprocity that I'd like you to think about is Annette Weiner's concept of inalienable possessions. Now, this is the idea of something that you could or would not give away from yourself. So, what is something that you have that you would never or could never give to someone else? So if you were to ask that question to, say, a Holocaust survivor, you would get a very different answer to, say, if you asked a teenage fan of Taylor Swift, for example. Okay, so what kinds of inalienable possessions can you think about in your life? I also want to play with some other kinds of ideas. What happens when you turn a gift into a commodity? What happens when gifts become commodified? This means turning the gift into a commodity. So, and we've seen this, up until the 1930s, for example, giving your fiancé a diamond ring was very uncommon. It was only after the De Beers company, the De Beers Diamond Company, started this marketing campaign in the 1930s that giving a diamond ring as a sign of your eternal love for your fiancé became a common practice. To the point that now, today, the average American spends about $4,000 on a diamond ring as a wedding engagement. And this is a practice that, through marketing, has become really common in all around the world. In Japan, the US, Australia, Europe. It's now a worldwide practice of giving a diamond ring, and most people will receive a diamond ring as a gift when they become engaged. Now, other kinds of gifts have been commodified, some less successfully. So, for example, when someone had a baby, tobacco companies tried to encourage people to buy a cigar as a gift. So the father of the baby would buy cigars for everyone. Of course, we wouldn't do that today because our understanding of tobacco is very different to when that marketing scheme first came up. Now, I also want to come up with another way of thinking about the gift, and this is inspired by the idea that the word for the gift in French is don, D-O-N, and gift can also mean talent, and the same in French. To have a gift is to be gifted. I'm a gifted pianist, or I have the gift of artistic insight, or to have a gift is a very unique concept, particular to specific cultures. Not all cultures have this notion of talent. When I was working in West Java, for example, people didn't have a notion of talent. Skill was something that was passed down through families. Learning how to be a dancer, learning how to be a musician was something that was passed down through to families. It wasn't something seen as talent. So why is it that in certain cultures we have this notion of a gift, the gift or a talent, and who does that gift come from, and who are we supposed to be reciprocating with when we exhibit that gift? So a gifted pianist, for example, if we want to see a gifted pianist, then we might feel that we have to pay to see that gifted pianist. So the notion of the gift, actually, even though it's a play on words in one way, is also very interesting to contemplate in terms of patterns of reciprocity and the cosmology of a group of people. I also want to challenge you to think about those instances where illness or disease has been thought of as a gift. I was inspired to think about this when I watched a TED Talk some years ago. A lady called Stacey Kramer it was only a 3-minute speech. She stood up on stage and said, imagine a gift that can bring your family closer together, can give you 8 weeks off work, can give your life new meaning, you can reach nirvana, you can reassess what is important in your life, and it's only going to cost you $55,000. And then she stunned her audience by saying, this was my gift, and showed a picture of a biohazard bag containing her brain tumour. Now, the idea of illness or disease as a gift must be very particular to certain individuals in certain kinds of societies. Certainly, the tuberculosis patients that I work with in Vietnam would not see their illness as a gift. So what is it about certain cultures and the configuration of certain societies and the organisation of certain cultures that allows an illness or a disease to be thought of as a gift, when in other societies or other kinds of disease are not seen as a gift? So this is something that, even though it's a play on the word gift, and it is a very interesting thing to contemplate.